Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, good evening, depending where you are. I'm Nick Burns, professor here at the Harvard Kennedy School. It's a great pleasure to welcome all of you to the launch of our two-year project, and that's to think through the future of the American Foreign Service. I'm here with two really close friends and close colleagues. Ambassador Marc Grossman is here. Ambassador Marcie Ries is here. The three of us have been working on this project. I think Marc Grossman and I first had a conversation about this 3 years ago. Marcie joined us. Ambassador Nancy McEldowney was with us for a long time. Then she had to depart for a very good reason. She had to depart. And so I just wanted to pay tribute to Nancy McEldowney in the process. This is, as I said, a long effort to think through an institution that the three of us care a lot about, and that's the career Foreign Service and the civil service of the United States. All of us served very proudly in the American Foreign Service, and we wanted to give something back to our brethren, and I see some of them online with us today who are currently serving to help them. The reason we embarked on the project, I think, is well known to almost everybody on this Zoom call, and that is that the Foreign Service is facing one of the greatest crises in its modern history, a crisis of a lack of support, of budgetary support, a crisis of a lack of leadership in some cases, a crisis of being sidelined in some other cases, and a crisis that goes to the depth of what it is for a country to have a modern, effective, powerful diplomatic corps. We argue in this report that the Foreign Service needs to be fundamentally reformed, that it needs to be stronger and to be, in business terms, higher performing. And we argue also that the times dictate this. Diplomacy's time has certainly come. Since 9/11, the United States, of course, has had to rely very heavily on its military and intelligence agencies. That'll continue to be the case. But it's time to elevate diplomacy alongside them in terms of the attention we give to it and the support we give to it. Why is that? It's because we live in an era of transnational challenges where a lot of the most acute challenges the United States is going to face cannot be resolved by the military and our intelligence community. Climate change, future pandemics, drug and crime cartels, all those dictate that we have a strong diplomatic corps, that our diplomats take the lead. Think of the foreign policy agenda of the next 12 to 24 months. We have to re-enter the climate change talks. Diplomats are going to do that. We have to re-enter the World Health Organization. Diplomats will do that. We have to try to negotiate an end to a nearly 20-year war in Afghanistan. Diplomats at the table will negotiate that. American Foreign Service officers will do that. We need to keep Iran and North Korea at bay and block their nuclear programs. We certainly are going to need to contend with two extremely difficult, powerful, authoritarian adversaries, China and Russia. And our diplomats, many on the screen today currently serving, are going to be leading in that effort. So there's certainly a time now for the United States to step up and to commit more to a modern foreign service and civil service. And we're convinced of that. Think of it another way, that in the last several decades, the United States, both Congress and administrations of both parties have said we had to reform the military after failure in Vietnam. That led to Goldwater Nichols and the joint military that we have today, the extraordinary military we have today. The intelligence communities, they have to reform themselves after 9/11 and after the failure of intelligence in Iraq in 2003. And so a similar effort has to be launched now for the Foreign and Civil Service. And it really has to come from the Foreign and Civil Service officers themselves. They're the ones who need to think through their future. They need to communicate to the new administration and to Congress what needs to be done. So that's the goal of this report, is to provide some very specific recommendations. And I think we'll put the report on chat. We'll give you an electronic link. I'll ask Allison Hilgeist in a minute to all let you know how you can access the report. If you want a printed copy, we can mail one to you. If you'd like an electronic version, that's easy as well. I do want to emphasize this has been a nonpartisan effort at the beginning for two reasons. Marc and Marcie and I, and Nancy when she was with us, felt very strongly that reform had to be bipartisan. Both parties had to make a commitment to reform of the Foreign Service. So we wanted to be nonpartisan. The other not so minor detail is Harvard University is the home of this project. It's where I'm employed, and Harvard mandates that everything we do of this nature be nonpartisan. We have been thoroughly nonpartisan. During the last year, we had grand dreams of having big conferences around the country where we'd sit down in hotels and government offices with people to talk about this. The pandemic forced us onto the Zoom platform. We've had 40 workshops. We've met with a little over 200 people. Who have we met with? A lot of active duty Foreign Service officers, a lot of recently departed Foreign and Civil Service officers, former ambassadors, friends of ours with whom we'd worked for a long, long time, foreign diplomats, to get a sense of how they have thought through reforming their foreign ministries in Latin America, in the Middle East, in Asia, and in Europe. We met with the military, and we learned a lot from our military brethren. We met with a group of very senior retired military officers, including 2 former chairs of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And they talked to us about reform had to be a brutal process of asking tough questions, and that the military had to own its failures and it had to look forward to reform itself. We talked to a group of former intelligence officers, including in various conversations, 2 former directors of the CIA. They had the same message for us. Has to come from within. People have to be dedicated to it. You do need outside support, but you have to reform yourself. We engaged the Trump State Department, had a series of very good meetings with people at the undersecretary level, with the Director General of the Foreign Service, the Director of the Foreign Service Institute, and we profited from those meetings to see how the Trump administration is thinking about reform. We met with the Biden transition team, as you would expect, because they have an intense interest in this subject. We met with 4 former secretaries of state. We had worked for all of them. Madeleine Albright, Colin Powell, Condi Rice, Hillary Clinton. Boy, we learned a lot from them. They were all very interested, very engaged. They had a lot of ideas. They deeply care about the future of the Foreign Service. And similarly, had a very productive meeting with 3 former national security advisors from both parties, Steve Hadley and Tom Donilon and Susan Rice. And they really challenged us to think boldly and think creatively about the future of the service. And of course, we've been meeting with members of Congress, both in the US Senate and the US House of Representatives in both parties. We've met with staffs of the major committees in the Senate and House that have to deal with the State Department. And we really thought that we had to go out and talk to citizens about this. And so we have met with roughly 800 American citizens in town hall meetings. We've met with think tank conferences, a lot of university discussions, not just on the Harvard campus, but elsewhere. And then we took advantage of this extraordinary organization, the World Affairs Councils of America. And we met with World Affairs Council chapters in at the University of, in Dallas, Fort Worth, Peoria, Nashville, Cleveland, Boston, and we're going to be talking at the World Affairs Council annual meeting tomorrow. And last but not least, and this is definitely not least, we've relied on the guidance of Ambassador Eric Rubin and the American Foreign Service Association. They don't have to own anything that we're recommending. In fact, I'm sure they'll disagree with some of what we're recommending, but the wisdom and experience of AFSA has been really important. All 3 of us are members of the American Foreign Service Association, and we'll be doing an event with Ambassador Rubin and the AFSA membership on Thursday, just to really listen to the thoughts of our currently serving and retired officers. All of this was done with one purpose, and that's to honor the women and the men of the current Foreign Service, the people that we really care about and that we feel we have a debt to repay, to be true to them and true to the Foreign Service, which we're so proud of. So I want to thank all of the people who have helped us along the way. Finally, have to thank Harvard Kennedy School, because Harvard Kennedy School has helped to establish the project and underwrite the project. And Allison Hilgeist, we could not have done this project without you, the Deputy Director of our Future Diplomacy Project. We wouldn't have this meeting, we wouldn't have the electronic version or the print version without Allison Hilgeist. We wouldn't without Caroline Kim. Caroline is a 2nd-year student at the Harvard Kennedy School. She's a really smart person who's a Wrangell Fellow. She's going to enter the Foreign Service this coming June and July. We're very proud of Caroline. You know, as we talked about all these difficult issues, and they're really difficult issues, we would sometimes apologize to Caroline saying, we hope you still want to join the Foreign Service after talking about all these big problems for a couple of hours, but she will, and she's going to make us proud. We're very thankful to Georgi Kent. Georgi's a Harvard College junior. He's an undergrad, and he and Caroline have been our research assistants, and they have done fabulous work. Archival research, looking deep into the history of the Foreign Service, looking at US law. And Georgi couldn't be here because he's in class, but I know his dad is here. And I know his dad, our friend George Kent, is really proud of his son, Georgi. I want to thank Naima Green Riley. Naima was a Foreign Service officer. She served in Alexandria and in China. She's now a Harvard PhD student. Because she is slightly younger by about 4 decades than the rest of us, she was able to give us real insights into the Foreign Service of today and to what some of the younger officers are thinking of. And Naima, I know you're here, and I want to thank you on behalf of Mark and Marcie for that. Thank you to Erica Manaselis and Catherine Kluver of the Future Diplomacy Project. And finally, we had a lot of supporters here that gave us the support to carry out this project. Nick Kukrika and Andrea Kukrika, Scott Nathan, Dwight and Kirsten Polar, and Seth and Beth Klarman. These are people who believed in us, and we're thankful to them. And the Una Chapman Cox Foundation and our great friend, Ambassador Lino Gutierrez. They've been engaged, they've been supportive, they've been an active part of this, as they always are, on every project to support the Foreign Service. So thanks you to everybody. Here's the order of battle. I'm going to ask Mark and Marcie to add, subtract, correct any mistakes in my introduction. And then the three of us thought we would run down very, very quickly the 10. Hopefully the recording continues. We're going to run down the 10 action steps that comprise the heart of this report. What are the action steps or the reforms that need to be undertaken by the Congress and the new administration and administrations into the future to reform the Foreign Service? So that's what we'll do. Then we'll take your questions and comments. We hope that you'll let us know what you think, challenge us, disagree if you wish. We're looking forward to a good conversation, and we'll conclude this by 11:45 a.m. Mark and Marcie, look forward to your comments.
Good, Nick. Thank you very much. Just to introduce myself, my name is Marc Grossman. Nick, I think you covered the waterfront. I just wanted to make 4 quick points. First, just to emphasize the point that you made about why we did this. And you very rightly said it was to honor the people, men and women who are serving all around the world today. And that is absolutely true. The other reason that we did this, all of us, was for the people who will serve in the future, because we think that Americans will need great diplomats for years and years and years to come. So we hope that some of these reforms, some of these ideas will attract more people, will attract new people and attract them in a different way. Second, just to emphasize, as you did, the importance of nonpartisanship. Third, and I'll get to this, very important point that you made about the Foreign Service culture itself. One of the things we've been very honest about is that the problems did not come to us 100% from the outside. And one of the things that the service will have to do is to earn its way back to this effort to be the central executor and policymaker inside of the United States government. And fourth, I know people don't go immediately to the acknowledgement section of any of these reports, but Nick really gave you a sense of who has helped us. And it's been an enormous and terrific group of people. And so I hope that when you get the report, go back there and look at the acknowledgements, because we owe so many people so much thank you. And I just wanted to join Nick in thanking everybody who's helped us get to the day, get to this day. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Marcie, Ambassador Ries.
Hi, my name is Marcie Ries, and I have to say I really have enjoyed being a part of this project. We're now entering a new phase. We've only accomplished one part, which is to produce our report. And the next phase is to get support for our recommendations and hopefully some forward movement on them. So I hope all of you will think hard about it, will provide us with your comments, will engage with us, and in the future will become supporters of a project that will need a lot of support from the new administration, from the Congress, and also especially from current and former Foreign Service officers if it is to succeed.
Marcie, thank you. Before we go down our list of action steps, Allison, I just want to make sure that we can make this report available electronically to people on this Zoom call. They can also elect a print copy. People made fun of me, the younger people at the Kennedy School, print copies. I said, yes, print copies, because I'm an older guy. Allison, do you want to tell people how they can do that?
Hi, good morning, everybody. I will repost the link in the chat to anybody who joined late and didn't see the link previously. But also on that page, if you would like to request a printed copy, you can do so there. We are in special circumstances, so it will take longer than it usually would. So we appreciate your patience in advance.
Allison, thank you again. So let's go down. Why don't the three of us just go down the 10 action steps that we're proposing. This is a 71-page report. It's deeply researched because we're an academic institution. We wanted to have endnotes. We do, thanks to Caroline and thanks to Georgi Kent. But we have 10 action steps. I'll just start, Marc and Marcie, with the first one, and we'll march down them. I think we know the order we're going to go in. The first thing that we're recommending that a new administration and Congress do is rethink and redefine the mission and mandate of the Foreign Service. It's not often that Congress or even any American president stops to think, what's the mission of this cabinet agency? And this is the oldest cabinet agency in the United States government, first to be created. That's why the Secretary of State's fifth in line to the presidency. And we think that the Congress and president should work on a bipartisan basis to rethink this, because we have a Foreign Service that is grounded in many ways. It's not the fault of the men and women of the Foreign Service, but in terms of the authorization in the Cold War. And so we're calling on the Congress and the president to do that. We think there should be much stronger budgetary support going forward for the State Department from administrations in Congress. We don't think the State Department and USAID can do their jobs without that. So we're calling on President-elect Joe Biden and Congress to define a new mandate and a new mission for the Foreign Service. One part of that will be to protect the authorities that an American ambassador has overseas. And that's to be the president's personal representative, to receive that letter from the president saying, you're in charge of American interests in a particular country. And a lot of our brethren from other agencies tell us that that position is being eroded. So that's the first thing. Marc, I think you're next.
Yes, Nick, thank you very much. So I'd just like to talk for a moment about this idea that we have for a new Foreign Service Act. And I will say up front that when we started this effort, we weren't sure what we thought about this question. In fact, I think most of us leaned a little bit toward leave things as they are. As you all know, the three acts this century, 1924, 1947, 1980, actually last century, are the defining aspects of the Foreign Service. And we listened very carefully to the people who we had a chance to speak to. And we came over these 6 or 7 months to believe that it was time to have a new Foreign Service Act. I should say, first of all, that we recognize that that's not without risk. And we especially listened to those of our colleagues, current and former, who told us about their anxieties and their worries about a new Foreign Service Act. And we tried very hard to be clear in the report that there are many things in the 1980 Act that should be moved forward, indeed must be moved forward. And you'll read in there that we would oppose any new Foreign Service Act that didn't have the basic principles of the 1980 Act. But for a couple of important reasons, we thought this is the time to go forward. One, 40 years, so much has changed. It's time to have people rethink the purposes of the Foreign Service. Secondly, we also listened carefully to our military and intelligence colleagues. And what did they tell us? Unless you have some of these things in the law, they won't last. You can't hold on to them. And that's the lesson of Goldwater-Nichols. And so if you think about the recommendations that follow, so many of them would be so much more powerful if they're in the law. I'll give you one example. 15% added number of people for training, for professional education. And what happens if that's not in the law and they're not fenced off? Boom, they end up someplace else. So the money for those people, the purpose of those people are the kinds of things that we'd like to keep into this law. Final point for me on this chapter. Is it possible? Well, one of the things that we learned in our 7 months is there's considerable interest on Capitol Hill, Republicans and Democrats, in possibly doing something in this area. And as Marcie said, the next step is the hard step, which is, can we get support for this report? And part of that will be to discover whether there's interest in a new Foreign Service Act. So Nick, thank you very much. Oh, I'm sorry.
You got the next one, Mark.
All right, I was looking at the wrong piece of paper. So the next one is change the culture. And as you can imagine, this is an enormously challenging question. But we were honest, very honest, first with ourselves, and then we were honest with every group that we met, which was to say that, as I did before, that many of the problems that are today in the Foreign Service are not problems that came to us from the outside, that they have to do with the culture inside of the Foreign Service. And so we wanted very much to speak to that openly. You'll see in the report that the very first thing is what's good about the culture, because there's so much that's good about the culture. There's service and patriotism and sacrifice and family. And those are all things that should be honored. We wanted to start with that. But there's also huge challenges to the service, and we'll come to many of them. There's a question of telling truth to power. There's questions of diversity. There's questions of how we speak to each other. You all speak to each other now as peers. There's become a lack of trust between the service and the political leadership. And so there are a whole list of things that are cultural changes that need to be dealt with. And we've offered some ideas about how to do so. Finally, and that's risk. One of the things that you hear about Foreign Service people is, oh, Foreign Service people don't take risk. Well, one of the people who was on the call said, are you kidding me? Look at the plaques on C Street. People take plenty of risk. And so there's no question, I think, about the physical courage of people. It's the question of, is there risk taking inside of the policymaking area? But because risk is so important, we wanted to help the argument to move from risk avoidance to risk management. And it's one of the reasons that we are strong supporters of the American Academy of Diplomacy's effort to change the Accountability Review Board system. And I know that there are a number of people from the AAD on this call today, and we thank you for that, and we highlight it in our report. Thank you very much.
Mark, thank you. So we're recommending first, change the mission and mandate of the State Department, refine it for the 21st century. Second, we believe that Congress should pass the new Foreign Service Act. Third, we believe it's only really the currently serving officers who can work on the culture to transform the service from the ground up. And here's a fourth, and it's not fourth in importance. It's the extraordinary crisis of diversity within the State Department and Foreign Service and civil service today. I think in every meeting that we had, this came up. In every meeting that we had, we heard testimony from currently serving officers, from the affinity groups that are working on this, of the lack of progress. If you look at the senior Foreign Service today, in 2020, the representation of African Americans, of Latino officers is not much, hasn't changed much in the 20 years since 9/11. If you look at African American ambassadors, in the Trump administration, there are 189 ambassadors, 5 of them are African American. In President Obama's administration, 46 African American ambassadors. In President George W. Bush's administration, 44 African American ambassadors. There's a crisis. We heard it from the junior officer ranks, from the mid-level ranks, from the senior level ranks. Our recommendations are that the next Secretary of State and the next Deputy Secretary of State have to be absolutely seized by this problem, and they have to own the problem, and they have to lead. A lot of people said, and we say too, there should be a chief diversity officer in the State Department to promote change through the ranks, both at home and overseas. But that chief diversity officer is only going to be able to succeed if the new Secretary of State and Deputy Secretary of State have owned the problem themselves and want that person in the process to succeed. You'll see in the report that we believe that Congress and the administration should consider the establishment of an ROTC type effort for the State Department and USAID to reach young kids in high schools, colleges, graduate schools, to encourage them, especially kids from young people from underrepresented communities, to encourage them to think about a career of public service in the Foreign Service, and also to then have the government help them afford the cost of education to get to the Foreign Service. We heard a lot of very good ideas from the affinity groups. There's so much good that's happening at the ground level up from foreign and civil service officers who've taken this diversity issue on. We met with a lot of them. They're the true experts, and I hope some of them will speak up today. What they told us is, if you have a structural problem like diversity, it requires bold structural solutions. And so that's what we're trying to suggest. They also said to us, you've got to enforce accountability. When someone is assessed for promotion as a junior officer to the mid-levels, or a mid-level officer to senior level, or a senior officer up for an ambassadorship or a deputy chief of mission position, they really shouldn't be promoted unless they have proven that they are not just sensitive to diversity, but they've done something about it. They've mentored someone, they've pushed for change, they have pulled somebody up to positions of responsibility and been a good friend and a good boss to those people. And so we think that needs to be mandated. That was the advice that we had from the affinity groups, and we were convinced by it. So I think our fifth priority, action step, is professionalization for our diplomats. And Marcie, I think you're going to walk through that one.
Yes, indeed. So when he was Secretary of State, Colin Powell was fond of asking people, so how much training and education have you had? And a lot of Foreign Service officers would say, well, if you don't count language training, maybe a few months here and there. Oh, Secretary Powell would say, I had about 7 years in a career of 30 plus years. So he took on this subject, as did several other secretaries of state, who brought us the Foreign Service Institute, the wonderful facility in Arlington, a new leadership and management school, a center for the study of lessons learned, but much more needs to be done to increase the professionalization of the Foreign Service. Today, our approach to education is actually one of training. By that, I mean, we teach people tradecraft, and we, I think, do a pretty good job of it. But instead, what the Foreign Service needs is a career-long commitment to education. It needs to be that when you come in the Foreign Service, you get a really serious orientation to our diplomatic history and to Washington and to the craft of diplomacy. Then at about the mid-level, there needs to be very serious management training. This relates to Nick's comments about diversity in particular. People talked about how first-time managers really weren't helpful in launching new entrants on their career. And so it really is very important to teach those first-time managers the skills that they need. And finally, at the senior level, we think that there needs to be another 6 months of training. And that training ought to be shared with people from other cabinet agencies who work on foreign policy and with military officers. That kind of cross-pollination is really very important. The Foreign Service has really in a way, a learn by doing mentality, and that needs to change. From that to a commitment to career-long education.
Marcie, thank you. Thank you very much for that. And that's our fifth recommendation, professionalization. Marc Grossman is now going to review 3 really big structural changes that we're proposing for the career foreign and civil service. Marc, you're muted.
I was relying on the outside to unmute me. Thank you very much. I'm going to start with the question of personnel, making the personnel system more modern and flexible. And I will start right where Marcie did, which is first of all to pay tribute to the work that has been done over the past 20 or 25 years to make the personnel system better. And we give a lot of respect to the changes that have been made. And we had a very good set of sessions, as Nick said, with the current administration, with the Director General, the Undersecretary for Management, and many of the things that they are doing cross very clearly with what we are proposing as well. But there's no question that major change needs to be made. And so what we've tried to do is lay out a series of ideas and then give thought to what this new personnel system would look like. And what I'd like to do for my moment or two to talk about personnel is to talk a little bit specifically and give you a sense of numbers and money of what it is that we are recommending. First, as I said in my introduction, the fundamental recommendation, and in fact, it runs through the entire report, is to now finally get a 15% float for training and transit, mostly for professional education. And it should be fenced off, and it should be funded long into the future. Without this, very little of the other things we've recommended really will have a great foundation. And what number would that be? Well, today that would be about 2,000 new Foreign Service people, and it would cost about $400 million. And we want to make sure, as I say, that this is fenced off. It's for the purposes of professional education. And that was certainly an idea that we got, as Marcie said, from our military colleagues. Second, then, we've had the question from many of the people we've spoken to, is the Foreign Service the right size? We thought about this considerably, and while there have to be some decisions made, one, to get the 15%, two, to get most Foreign Service people out into the field and not in Washington, to shrink down some of the giant embassies that have been built after the land wars, that after those things are done, we think the Foreign Service ought to grow by another 1,400 to 1,800 positions. That's about $600 million, $800 million. And I would say, given the analysis that's been done, most of that will come in office management specialists, doctors, IT. Those are where the gaps are, and those are the gaps that need to be filled. And so it's 15%, it's getting the structure right and moving on to another 1,400 or 1,800 people. I'd like then for a moment then to go to the next recommendation, number 7, which is to adapt to a new world of work, a modern and more flexible, by having a mid-level entry program. And I know this is one of the recommendations that will be controversial. And again, a little bit like the Foreign Service Act, we didn't start out with a predetermined view on what we wanted here. But we came to think, after 7 months of working on this, that the world is changing. The world is changing. The people we're recruiting are changing. The way work is done is changing. And we have to deal with this new world. One of the things that we have come to conclude, though, is that while the world is changing, there are certain things that remain extremely important to a foreign service of the United States of America, to an American diplomatic service. And that is hierarchy, and it is discipline, and it's experience. These are still things that matter to the conduct of diplomacy. The other thing that we found, Ambassador Burns and his work, myself, Marcie, we teach, we mentor. And what do we find? There are many people who are interested in joining the Foreign Service for a career. And there ought to be an availability and a tendency to make sure that they can do this. The question is, though, how do you find the right balance? How do you use a defined mid-level entry program to bring in people with specialties in AI, in food security, in climate, things that people need? It's also a very important way, I think, to increase the possibilities for diversity inside of the Foreign Service. And it may be a way also to bring people back into the service who have left over the past few years. What we're recommending is an experiment in this to see if we can find the right balance, to bring in 25 mid-level entrants in a first year, 25 in a second, 50 in a third, and up to about 500 people overall, and see how this works. Final point here is that these people, recruits in the mid-level entry, would have to meet extremely rigorous and clear criteria, because one of the worries, of course, is that it could be used for politicization. but you will see in our report a very clear set of criteria about mid-level entrants. Final point from me, and that's number 8. And that is, we came to conclude that it was time now, after many years of talking about it and thinking about it, to go ahead and get a diplomatic reserve corps. In our careers, what did we see? We saw that when it came time for the State Department to surge into an emergency, it was hard to do. We also found that it was hard to bring people in terms of specialized skills who would only want to serve for a short period of time. We also think that a diplomatic reserve corps would be a reciprocal agent, and that people who came to the State Department for a reserve career, for their training, for assignments, for deployments, would then go back to their home communities and be ambassadors for the State Department and for the Foreign Service. And so you'll see in the report, we've recommended again a test of this, of hiring 250 reservists over a period of 4 years for 1,000. We were greatly benefited by some work that was done for us, a first order piece of work on the budget, probably in the $20–25 million range over the first few years, and then probably about $35 million a year to keep this sustained beyond. If you think of the numbers that I've been talking about, $400 million for 2,000 people at 15%. Over time, another $600 to $800 million for 1,400 to 1,800 more people. A reserve corps that you could fund for $35 million a year. For us, that seems, of course, like money. But of course, in the scope of things, those are the kinds of pieces that we will call on the Congress and the administration to proceed with, to better balance and to strengthen the U.S. diplomatic service. So I know, Marcie, we leave you to last for a new name.
We've got one more before we do that, Mark, and that's a minor issue of appointments. Let me just say, first of all, I've been following the discussion in chat, and it's really good. We use chat in class. We think it really enhances discussion, and I thank everybody who's contributing ideas on chat. We have 2 more action steps that we're recommending, and the 9th is this. We need a stronger and more nonpartisan foreign service. What does that mean? We need the Foreign Service. We believe the Foreign Service should have a greater access to senior positions. We're the only country in the world that has such a high number of political appointees, both at the State Department in Washington and overseas in the ambassadorial corps. Since the Kennedy administration, the average of the ratio of serving ambassadors' career to political is about 70% to 30%, 70% career ambassadors in most administrations, 30% political appointee ambassadors. These are Democrat and Republican administrations who've sustained this particular practice now for about 60 years. We think it should change. We think it should change because if you don't provide access at the climax of a career, the end of a career, to our well-trained, experienced Foreign Service officers, access to positions of responsibility within the State Department in Washington and the ambassadorial level, then you're really depriving the United States of your most experienced officers serving where they're needed most. A couple of data points. The State Department has more political appointees than any other cabinet agency of the United States government. Currently, of our 23 Senate-confirmed Assistant Secretaries of State, not a single one of them is a career Foreign Service officer. We believe that's the first time in a century, the history of the Foreign Service, where that's taken place. These are ambassadorial level, the line managers of our foreign policy in every region of the world, on every big sector in the world. And for the first time, not a single one of those people right now in the State Department is a Senate-confirmed Foreign Service officer. There are some Foreign Service officers in acting capacity, but the Trump administration has decided not to put them up over the last several years for Senate confirmation. We think that has to change. And so we're recommending, frankly, substantial change to the way that Republican and Democratic administrations act towards the Foreign Service. We believe that 90% of our ambassadors should be Foreign Service. We believe that 75% of our Assistant Secretary of State should be career service, foreign and civil service in both cases. We certainly believe that by law, the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, traditionally the third ranking person in the State Department, should be a career Foreign Service officer. There are 5 undersecretaries, perhaps 2 of them, including the Undersecretary for Political Affairs, should be career officers. We think these changes should be mandated and put into American law. Let me tell you how this was received. In our conversations on Capitol Hill with former secretaries of state, with people in both political parties, this is real change. And I think we probably had more opposition, frankly, outside the Foreign Service to these reforms of any that we're recommending, but we're standing by them. We can't imagine, or can you imagine, if we so politicized the military, the officer corps? We wouldn't think of it. We wouldn't think of having a political appointee captain an aircraft carrier. We have not politicized the intelligence community, and we shouldn't. We think there's a real role for political appointees, a real role. We have outstanding people from business, from universities, from think tanks become American ambassadors. Some of them are in this call, and they're close friends of ours, and we've talked to them about this. We have outstanding political appointees in the State Department. We want a role for them. But right now, the Foreign Service is essentially, and the Civil Service are essentially blocked from a lot of leadership positions. And why train an entire corps of people over the course of 25 to 30 years and then say to them, but you can't compete for most of the top jobs? It doesn't make sense for the United States. That's our position. And we're sticking with it. And this is going to be a very tough conversation. I think in the real world, in Washington, we understand that. I won't name the people who called me and my brethren crazy for promoting this ideas. But if it's crazy, we believe in this kind of craziness for the future. So that's our 9th action step. And Marcie, we've saved the best for last. It's something we didn't plan on, but it kind of emerged in the conversation.
Before I launch into the name, I just want to quickly pick up something that I saw in the chat where somebody raised the question of the population, the average American knowing about the Foreign Service. And that's something we've thought quite a lot about, is a better alignment between the Foreign Service and the average American, between what we do for people, and so that they know about it. And that's one of the advantages actually of a Foreign Service Reserve, because those people live in communities, and they, after they serve in the Foreign Service, would go back to those communities and share what they've done and what diplomats are doing on the front lines for the American people. Now to the name. So we brought up the question of a new name in many of our workshops, and I have to say I was a little surprised that the reaction was pretty uniformly positive to changing it. And talking to people in the business community, a lot of them underscored, all the literature says that if you undertake very serious transformation, changing the name should be part of it. Foreign, in fact, seems a little quaint to our ears. The name Foreign Service, then it wasn't really a name, it just described a category, really came up in the 19th century, and it was talking about the consular service and our representation, which at that time was at the level of minister. But today, looking at it, it seems backwards of what we want to start with the word foreign. So we think starting with United States is far better. Diplomatic describes what we do diplomacy, and service is what we are committed to. So the name that we came up with was the United States Diplomatic Service. And we think that that would be a good way to show that we really have undertaken basic transformational change of a service that is ready to go forward into the 21st century.
Marcie, thank you. As Marcie said, we actually polled people at the end of nearly all the 40 workshops, and you can count on one hand the people who thought this was not a good idea. There was overwhelming support that we should be the United States Diplomatic Service. So those are our 10 action steps. You can behind the executive summary is each of these has a detailed chapter with a lot of research, a lot of data to try to buttress our recommendations for what we're trying to do. I think this amounts to bold transformational reform. Our friend Ambassador Christy Kenny told us in our very first meeting, she said, you've got to be bold. So I don't know if Christy's on today, but we always thought of Christy, our former ambassador to Thailand and the Philippines when we thought about big transformational change. We'd welcome your comments. You all know Zoom protocol. Just go into the participants bar at the bottom, or maybe it's at the top of your screen if you have an iPad. Just press the raise hand button. We'll call on people in order. We'll get as many people in as we can. We're looking for your feedback, any questions. And I see Marc Hanis first, and then Ambassador Cynthia Schneider.
Thanks so much, and thanks for the great work on this report. In terms of the diversity inclusion, I love the recommendation to appoint a chief diversity officer. I was curious, the NFL and the legal community have adopted the Rooney Rule, or it's called the Mansfield Rule, as an inclusion rule to start being more intentional about when you hire, promote people, you look at their demographic makeup. And I was wondering if you discussed creating an inclusion rule, and if so, why did it not make the cut? And if not, what do you think about an inclusion rule?
Marc, thank you. And we'll try to, we're happy to carry on more extended conversations, everybody. We'll just try to give you a quick answer to your question so that we can then get a lot of people in, but I'm happy to follow up with you, or any of us would be. We did not debate a Rooney type rule of the NFL solution, but we did, the advice we received from affinity groups is you need to look at recruitment. And that's the idea that we've adopted, other people suggested to us, of an ROTC type program that would really focus on underrepresented communities in the United States. You have to look at retention, because we are losing people at the junior officer level, including people on this call who've decided that they had to leave because they didn't feel that the path forward was a straight and true one for themselves. It wasn't open to them. And we've lost people at the senior level. A lot of this, so you've got to think of it from soup to nuts: recruitment, retention, and promotion, how you promote people. We talk to businesses. Businesses look down into the ranks and try to identify leaders of the future, and they give them special training. The State Department and Foreign Service and Civil Service ought to do that. We ought to be identifying people for promotion, and the people who are in charge have to be held accountable to progress. But we didn't go to a Rooney type rule, and we can talk about that at more length if you wish. Cynthia, great to see you, Ambassador Cynthia Schneider.
Thanks so much, Nick, and bravo, all of you. This is really, really exciting. First, I volunteer. If you need a political appointee ambassador to support fewer political appointee ambassadors, I'm happy to do that. I say this to Marc Grossman, who swore me in. But a small dose of reality. For the big posts in Europe, which mine, the Netherlands, doesn't fall into, but Great Britain, Rome, Paris, the political appointee ambassadors there spend a lot of their own personal money on representation, which you all know is not, wine and salmon, but actually connecting with the country that you're in. So something budgetarily needs to be done so that foreign service officers can just as easily do that as they should. And, it's happened in the past. Admiral Crowe was the ambassador in London. It's not impossible, but that is just a fact. Then the risk, that it's so important that you bring in risk. As Marc may remember, I held the first international biotechnology conference that had ever been held in state. I don't think a career officer could have done that. It could have been a catastrophe. And aside from a brief bomb threat, it was actually a huge success and led eventually to the State Department becoming much more engaged in biotechnology, eventually having the ambassador of biotechnology. But for a career officer, it was very risky. So the risk is really, really important. Then I have a question. I didn't hear you mention this, and perhaps I missed it somehow, but what about cones, which also seem to me to be a vestige of another era? And I gather there's more blurring, but I mean, who thinks politics is separate from economics, is separate from refugees and migration? And, you know, this is my shtick, public diplomacy and cultural diplomacy. You know, everyone should be engaging in every job they have. And you have officers like Bruce Wharton, who's done that in Africa. I mean, it's happening. But, you know, artists, cultural leaders are not some little separate thing that you do on Sunday afternoon. You know, I'm working with them, they're countering violent extremism in Mali and all over the Sahel. And I want you political people to listen to them. So what are you doing about breaking down the cone structure?
Cynthia, thank you very much and thank you. If everyone doesn't know, Ambassador Schneider was a real leader when we were ambassadors together in Western Europe on cultural diplomacy, on American soft power, and I always appreciated that about Cynthia's time as ambassador to the Netherlands. I think Mark and I can both answer your question. Mark, I'll take the first issue. Maybe you could take the second. Then I'm going to call on Ambassador Negroponte, John Negroponte, and Irv Hicks, and Mike McKinley. I've just seen them all line up with their blue raise hand button, so I'll call on you next. On the issue of expenses that ambassadors have to assume in certain countries versus others, that should not be a factor in denying to a currently serving foreign service officer becoming ambassador in one of those countries. The State Department should make up the difference. If that is an issue, I think it has been in the past, and the State Department's done it in the past. I remember with Ray Seitz, when Ray became career foreign service officer, ambassador to London, State Department said, we don't expect you to dig into your pocket for $5 trillion to maintain, you know, the activities of the embassy. So I think that can be done, but thank you for raising it. And we didn't want to get down in the weeds too much, but we do have a proposal on cones that Mark can talk about.
Yeah, thank you very much. We do have a proposal on cones, which is based exactly, Cynthia, on your idea, which is how is it possible to think about people in the various ways that they do their work, that they're not doing things all together. We thought, for example, who sees more people every single day in a host country than your young consular officer, right? That's not public diplomacy. Of course it is. That political officers say to themselves, oh, selling things for American business, promoting American exports, promoting American investment, that's somebody else's job. No, it's everybody's job. And so precisely for the points that you make, there are two places in the report where the cone system comes up. And in both cases, we've called it time to get rid of this caste system, which only draws distinction between people and creates tension inside of the State Department, not just inside the Foreign Service, between the Foreign Service and the Civil Service. And so we benefited from a lot of good advice. So what we've recommended is to abolish it, bring in everybody as diplomats, as we hope, diplomatic service officers and specialists, bring them all in together. And then everybody serves in various different places up to the time that they're getting ready to be tenured. In the middle, what do? You try to seek jobs that enhance your capacities rather than inside your specific cone, so that when people get ready to move into the senior ranks, they're ready to actually be leaders of the entire system. And so we thank you for raising it. As Nick said, we were a little bit worried about getting too far down into the cone, into the weeds, but twice we talk about cones and very much along the lines that you recommend.
Thank you, Mark. I just want to salute Ambassador John Negroponte, great Foreign Service officer and Deputy Secretary of State with whom I proudly served. John.
Thank you, Nick, and thanks to you and Marcie and Mark and all the others who've worked on this very important program. I was just reflecting on the fact that this past October 5th was my 60th anniversary of entering the United States Foreign Service. And I cherish all the experiences I had in the service and in the department. And I think you've got just a very rich report here in terms of the variety of recommendations. I sent a chat around on what concerns me as the main question, and that is legislation really needed to achieve this? And how much time would that take, as opposed to getting the new administration to implement the requisite policy changes as early as possible. And I was thinking particularly with respect to something like getting a good number of career people in assistant secretary positions in the department. Well, I mean, we want to get to the new administration about that and get the president to want to send a signal to the Foreign Service that he really cares about the service and makes those kinds of appointments very early on. I remember when I worked for President-elect Bush, I was still Deputy National Security Advisor. He told me when he named Ray Seitz, myself, Mike Armacost, several others to top Tom Pickering, to top diplomatic positions, he told me directly, I want to send a positive signal to the U.S. Foreign Service. So policy versus legislation. And then the other issue I raised was, I remember back in 1980, there was a lot of talk about an involvement actually in the legislation of the Foreign Agricultural Service, the FCS, and this and that. Do you deal with that, the issue of the other foreign services as well in your report? I haven't gotten into it that deeply yet.
John, congratulations on your 60th anniversary in the Foreign Service. That's an extraordinary
I
achievement.
don't know about that.
It's extraordinary. On your first point, one of the most memorable meetings we had was with former senior military officers, including 2 former chairs of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And they said, if you want to build change into the foreign and civil service, you've got to have it in law. If you need a training float, so the military has a 15% training float. At any given day, 15% of the military are training. Colin Powell spent 7 of 35 years in the Army in training. Mark and I probably a couple of months in our career outside of language training, truly. And it showed in my case, the lack of training, that's for sure. So we're trying to build this in, and they told us legislate it, because if it's not in legislation, it's going to disappear. We had a training float. Colin Powell gave us the training float. It disappeared when you and I were working together. You were Deputy Secretary, I was Undersecretary. We had to surge into Iraq and Afghanistan. We just didn't have enough people. And so we had to take people out of ambassadorships and senior positions and send them to Baghdad and Kabul, and we lost the training float. So we took that to heart. And part of the proposal that Mark reviewed is 15% training float. That's an increase in the size of the Foreign Service. It's legislated. So nobody can take it away from you without changing American law. So I hope that answers your question. Mark, do you want to add to that?
I would. Nick, I think, John, that you're exactly right, though. And one of the questions we've been asked is the question you asked, which is, aren't there some of these things that can be done right away? And absolutely. There are signals to be sent. There are jobs to be done. And so if you look through the report, you would hope that a new administration, and we hope, again, being nonpartisan, that whoever takes the oath of office, whoever was going to take the oath of office, and now President-elect Biden, there are things in this report that you could do right away. Absolutely. Second thing is, I just wanted to answer your second question on the Foreign Commercial Service, Foreign Agricultural Service. We found that we couldn't answer everybody's question. And so what we have said in the report is that we hope that some of the ideas that we've put forward will benefit the foreign services in other agencies. And that would certainly be true of the professional education, some of the other ideas. But we're very explicit in the beginning of the report. You'll see that we want these things to apply to them, but we just weren't prepared to take on and couldn't take on the whole answer to the question, for example, of, should they be reintegrated? How are they dealt with? The Director General, as you know, does have some scope on those foreign services as well. But we thought best to do what it is we could and leave some of this to the future.
Thank you very much. I want to call on Irv Hicks, who's a senior advisor in the Bureau for International Narcotics and Labor Affairs. Irv, great to have you with us.
Thank you very much. And I just simply can say how excited to see Asians Affinity Group, president for the Thursday Luncheon Group, to see them incorporated in this report. Very briefly, I just had a suggestion. So I was reading page 13 of the report, and I noted that the recommendation, career diplomats need to be connected more directly to the American people they serve. And I'm reminded that being a second generation Foreign Service officer, that I still have family members who think that both my father and I were running away from the law in terms of our constant going overseas. And so I would recommend that in terms of the rolling out of the report and getting the buy-in, that we place the importance that we serve the American people first and front and foremost. So therefore, it challenges that we are an elitist organization or a bunch of intellectuals of 1% or 6% of the population, but that we see our roles as public servant, service leadership that emphasizes taking care of the American citizens at home and abroad as part of the rollout. And thank you for giving me an opportunity to give my 2 cents. Over.
Irv, thank you. And thank you for the advice you gave us. And the Thursday lunch group, when we met with all of you, is really important to us. I think we learned more in that 1 2 hour, 3 hour session from all the affinity groups than just about any other session. So thank you for that. We are concerned, but I think this is an age-old concern with the Foreign Service that, you know, a good deal of our careers are spent overseas. And we spend years overseas. Sometimes you lose connections with the American people. We've got to work on connecting the work that we do, the consular work, the economic support with Americans, and convince Americans that there's merit in both USAID and the State Department. So it's a real abiding issue. And we do mention it in this report because we think that connection is being lost. The name change is not just a branding exercise. It's not cosmetic. If people out in the country see United States Diplomatic Service, they're going to probably understand what that means. But when we go around, I used to come home on home leave from the Middle East or Europe, and I'd tell high school buddies I'm in the Foreign Service. They had the Foreign Legion, they had no idea, a lot of them, what I was doing. I think we all have similar stories. So Irv, thank you for that. I'm just going down the list of people who've asked to speak. And we've got about 11 minutes left. And our great friend, Ambassador Mike McKinley, is next, and then Ryan Dukeman and Vic Marsh. We'll try to get all three in. Mike.
I'll keep it short, and congratulations, Nick, to you, Mark, Marcie, everyone who put together the report. And it has the virtue of really being focused on the State Department workforce as opposed to other efforts over the past decades, which range much more broadly and hopefully is going to find resonance. I just want to hone in on 2 quick points. The tribute to the work over the past 20 years being reflected is a good thing, but also Mark's point about focusing on short-term versus medium-term and long-term objectives, because in dialogue with the incoming administration or with Congress, it will be important to highlight what can be done quickly. And a final point on the diversity issue, I would note the current Secretary of State has refused to sign off on a memo for a chief diversity officer that's been presented to him a number of times, and is an issue which I think has to be addressed for its importance in sending the right signal from day one in a new administration. But if I can mention a point I've mentioned to a number of you in the past, when we're talking about diversity, it really provides a cover to not address the key issues, which are sexism and racism in the State Department. It's attitudes. It's not simply numbers. It's not positions. It's not promotion issues. It's how we treat each other on 2 of the most fundamental areas of human interaction. And I've seen it throughout my career, and I think it needs to be spoken of in terms like that. And a final point on new generations. I'm in favor of a radically flatter State Department management system. The frustration level among the 60% of State Department officers who have been in 10 years or less is huge, and it reflects the new world. They work differently, they bring different approaches to how to get things done, and we really need to start incorporating that much more directly into the way we work. Thank you very much.
Mike, thank you very much. And maybe I'll suggest that we hear from Vic and Ryan, and I don't see anyone else who's asked to speak. And then the 3 of us will just have a concluding comments, and we'll all do all that in the next 6 or 7 minutes. So Vic, and then Ryan.
Hi,
Vic,
thanks so much. Doing well. Good to see you all again, and thanks for your report. And I know everyone on this call cares immensely about lifting up underrepresented communities in the State Department. We want to tap the best of our country. And that's why I'm sure everyone would be interested and curious about the best and latest research on what actually helps unleash this diverse talent in our organizations. So I was shocked to learn myself that some of the most popular diversity initiatives actually are connected pretty strongly to negative future attainment of manager positions for minorities. It's really shocking stuff that, for example, this diversity evaluations, promotion criteria, some of the things recommended in this report, we'd predict basically an 8% drop in future Black male senior managers if that goes forward. It's just counterintuitive. We don't know why that works. And yet the thing that people roll their eyes at the most, like the announcement of an interdepartmental task force, strangely enough, the thing that people are most cynical about leads to the largest boosts in minority retention and promotions into senior ranks. So this is in study after study. We've got samples of 800 mid-cap firms, 700 large Fortune 500 firms, and most recently with Frank Dobbin, we've got a sample of higher ed institutions predicting faculty hiring diversity, which everyone said was different, but we see the same results. So I just want to encourage folks, I know we care. I know we earnestly want to lift up voices. We know that often the victims of discrimination tend to advance some of the ideas that help the least, unfortunately. And so we want to listen, we want to be in tune with the folks who have actually fallen victim to these things, but we know from legal settlement agreements that counterintuitively, they often ask for programs that are associated with further harm. So I just want us to take our care and our passion and turn it into actual effects. Because the danger here is that when we keep seeing that we're trying some stuff and it's not working, even good people can fall back on essentialist thinking. We know that they're not bad from the start. It's just that if everything you're trying sort of doesn't work, you start to wonder, hey, maybe the problem is with this guy Vic, and maybe it's inside him. Maybe it's inside these minorities and not the system itself. So thanks so much for your time, and look forward to remaining in touch and engaging.
Yeah, please stay in touch, Vic. We learned a lot from you. Remember, we had that long session, and thank you for saying what you did in that session, and thank you for the comments you made right now. We'll all respond just after Ryan. Ryan, you got the last question or comment.
Thank you so much, and I'm so glad to see the inclusion of a recognition in the report that a lot of the skill sets around which the Foreign Service was designed in the 1920s presaged or were premised on a world that was primarily geopolitical and bilateral. And I think we're now seeing with the pandemic and climate change primarily, but also issues like anti-corruption or data science and cyber issues, a need for these focusing on skills that are reflective of a transnational, often functional world. I know you addressed that in the report, and I think it's a great idea through having opportunities for specialists to come in at the mid-level or do a sort of reserve tour or short stint in office. Curious about how you're thinking about changing the curriculum at FSI for career diplomats to build out their skill sets, not just in traditional language and area expertise, but in some of these emerging functional specializations that are going to be critical for helping the State Department reclaim a leadership role in foreign policy that I think everyone on this call believes it should have. Thank you.
Ryan, thank you, and thanks to everybody who spoke. And if anybody has a question or comment for us, Allison, maybe you can post our emails, Mark and Marcie and my emails, and we're happy to talk to anybody about this, because we want to take this forward, and we're going to learn from all the constructive criticism. I would just make 2 points very quickly, because we don't have a lot of time, and ask Mark and Marcie to conclude the session. To Vic and to Mike, there's no question that the State Department itself and the foreign and civil services have to face up to an ugly history. If you think about the institutional racism and sexism in the past, in my first decade as a Foreign Service officer, there was a class action lawsuit by African American officers against the State Department and by female officers. And those lawsuits made sense. They were right because they had to force change on the department leadership. And that we have to own that history, all of us, whether we're active duty or in our case, retired Foreign Service officers. And we've tried to, embrace that spirit in the recommendations we've made. We got a lot smarter in talking to people like you, Vic. And I just wanted to also honor today the memory of a really great American ambassador, Ambassador Ed Perkins, who died on November 7th, African American, but someone who really, I think, was a mentor to a lot of people in the service and was a trailblazer for the service, a path breaker. And so we honor his memory. But certainly we've got to go further. I think the biggest takeaway of our 40 workshops is the crisis over diversity and the lack of progress. If you look at the numbers, there is no real progress being made with African American and Latino officers in terms of their percentage in the senior Foreign Service. And finally, to Ryan, I just say, yes, we've got to train officers not just for bilateral diplomacy, but for multilateral diplomacy. We need mid-level entry to bring specialized people in who are engineers and scientists, because we're not producing a lot of those people in the Foreign Service. I think we were encouraged by our military and intelligence officials to be the thought leaders, to be intellectual leaders, to reinforce that in our training, the kind of training we do at Harvard Kennedy School or Georgetown of our Wrangell and Pickering fellows. And they're going to be thought leaders. So that's important too. Mark and Marcie.
Okay. I'd like to mention that in the area of what can be done early on, attacking the problem of diversity is definitely in that category. The new administration, the new Secretary of State really should make that point at the very beginning. So that's one thought. On Ryan's point about functional specialization and science, we certainly do think that Foreign Service officers should be conversant with AI and with biotech and with all these things that do affect our diplomacy. And one of the other projects we engaged with was at Duke University, where they're looking at that question. That certainly is a contemporary 21st century question for the Foreign Service. So finally, I'll come back to where I started, which was about the point of building a consensus for the kinds of reforms that we are proposing. From this conversation, we can see that there are so many different constituencies and interested groups and people who will have to be brought along if there is to be the kind of big and bold change that we are proposing. So we really appreciate all of your engagement, your questions, your being with us today, and we hope that you will continue to be supporters of the kind of change that we are proposing.
Nick, I'd just like to follow Marcie right there, which is to say, first of all, my thanks to all of you, and to go back to a point we made in the beginning. What's the point here? The point is that to honor the people who are serving today, and we hope will serve for a long time in the future. And that's why we've put this effort in, and we want to honor them and make their lives and their careers even more successful. To Mike McKinley, I think the idea of flattening is really important. You'll find in the report a recommendation, for example, to reduce the number of DASs, Deputy Assistant Secretaries, and try to keep that number low. That's a start on that. Vic, I think that the points that you made today and have made in the past, extremely important. As I've thought about this, a core, in the end, it's about accountability. And it's about the accountability of each individual human being. And maybe what you and Mike McKinley have talked about are really two sides of the same coin. Because it's also a diversity of thought, right? It's how you think about things and how you operate inside the culture. So I think accountability is a core piece of the diversity question. And finally to Ryan, I think you're exactly right. It's not just though at FSI, where this training needs to take place. I wanted to make a follow on the point that Nick made. You'll see in our report a recommendation that people get a chance to go out to a geographically diverse group of universities and grad schools to get the kind of education that we need. And what would be the corollary advantage to that? The corollary advantage to that would be that you have more people out farther into the United States and a better way for Foreign Service officers and others in the Foreign Service and the Civil Service to get connected to Americans. And finally, as Marcie said, we certainly will ask for your support and hope we can count on it going forward. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Mark. And I just have to say, and because I'm an employee of Harvard University, we think the best geographically dispersed place is Cambridge, Massachusetts, but we can be open to other places too. We're in agreement on this. Thanks, everybody. Please let us know your thoughts, emails, phone calls. We're happy to meet and talk to anybody, and we're really grateful you spent some time with us today for the launch of our report. Thanks so much.